For 15 years, the buses crossed the border to be finished. For 15 years, a strange and uncomfortable reality defined one corner of Canada's manufacturing economy. Buses built by Canadian workers in a Canadian factory under a Canadian company name still had to cross the border into the United States before they could be finished. The highest value work, the final assembly, the skilled jobs that bring the biggest wages, all of it happened on American soil. But on March 3, 2026, something quietly changed in Winnipeg. A bus rolled off an assembly line fully completed, without crossing the border, without needing an American factory to finish the job. For the first time in 15 years, a major transit bus was built entirely in Canada from start to finish. And while it may look like just another vehicle leaving a factory floor, this moment carries a much deeper political meaning. Because what happened in Winnipeg is not just about buses. It is about the end of a dependency that was built by design, maintained by regulation, and now being dismantled by a government that has decided it can no longer afford to let the most valuable parts of its manufacturing economy happen somewhere else. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the system that made this dependency possible in the first place. For decades, American procurement rules, particularly the Buy America regulations, have required that transit vehicles purchased with U.S. federal funding meet strict domestic content rules. The policy currently requires at least 70% American-made components and final assembly on U.S. soil. On paper, these rules were designed to protect American manufacturing. In practice, they also shaped how companies across North America organized their supply chains. For Canada's New Flyer Industries, headquartered in Winnipeg and widely recognized as one of the largest heavy-duty bus manufacturers in North America, it meant a complicated production reality. The steel frames and structural work could be done in Winnipeg. The labor-intensive early stages of production stayed in Canada. But the buses still had to be shipped south to U.S. facilities for final assembly in order to qualify for American transit contracts, which remain one of the largest markets for buses anywhere in the world. So for 15 years, the system created a paradox. Canada owned the brand, the engineering talent, and much of the production capacity. Yet some of the most valuable parts of the manufacturing process were tied to American soil by regulatory design. Think about what that means. Every time a Canadian worker welded a frame or installed a component in Winnipeg, they were building a product that could not be completed in their own country. Every time a bus left the factory floor, it was incomplete. Not because Canadian workers lacked the skills, not because Canadian facilities lacked the equipment, but because American regulations made it economically impossible to finish the job at home. The final assembly, the stage where the highest value is added, where the most complex integration happens, where the best-paid jobs are concentrated, all of it had to happen in the United States. Then the political environment began to shift. Trade tensions between Washington and several partners intensified in 2025, and Canada found itself under growing tariff pressure on a number of exports. At the same time, policymakers in Ottawa started asking a broader question. Not just how to negotiate exemptions, but how to reduce structural dependence on the American market. The result was a relatively modest, but strategically important investment. Governments and industry partners contributed funding, including support from the province of Manitoba and the federal government, to help expand production capability in Winnipeg and establish a full domestic assembly line. The numbers themselves may not sound enormous compared with defense or aerospace projects, but the effect could be significant. The project is expected to create roughly 250 direct manufacturing jobs while supporting thousands of existing positions connected to the broader production network. In its first week of operation, the facility began producing buses that were fully completed in Canada for Canadian transit systems. The goal, according to company leadership, is to scale up production gradually, with hundreds of fully assembled units targeted each year once the system reaches full capacity. But here is where the strategic calculation becomes clear. This is not just about capturing value that was previously lost to the United States. This is about building resilience. Because if the Trump administration has demonstrated anything in the past year, it is that trade agreements can be weaponized, that exemptions can be revoked, and that economic relationships that seemed stable for decades can become instruments of political pressure overnight. Canada learned this lesson with USMCA. It learned it again when aluminum tariffs were threatened. And it learned it most recently when the cross-border auto industry suddenly became a negotiating chip in unrelated diplomatic disputes. The Winnipeg factory is a hedge against that instability. It means that if American procurement rules tighten further, if Buy America requirements become even more restrictive, if trade relations deteriorate to the point where cross-border manufacturing becomes unviable, Canada will still have the capacity to build transit buses for its own cities. That capacity is not hypothetical. It is operational. It's producing vehicles right now. And that changes the negotiating position. Because when you can walk away from a market, you are no longer entirely dependent on access to it. Now look at the broader context. This is happening at the same time that Canada is securing critical mineral deals with Germany, Japan, and South Korea. At the same time that rail shipments are being diverted from American routes toward ports in Vancouver and Montreal for export to Europe and Asia. At the same time that Mark Carney walked away from Trump's USMCA ultimatum and the Canadian dollar actually strengthened because markets believed Canada had alternatives. The pattern is consistent. Canada is systematically reducing its dependence on the United States across multiple sectors simultaneously. This is strategic decoupling, not the dramatic, headline-grabbing version where trade wars escalate into full rupture. The quiet, methodical version where you build capacity at home, diversify your export markets, and position yourself so that when the next shock comes, you have options. Winnipeg is one piece of that strategy. The critical mineral agreements are another. The Indo-Pacific trade corridors are a third. None of them individually transforms the Canadian economy, but together they create a different architecture. One where Canada is less vulnerable to American policy volatility. And this is where the story connects to something larger. Because what Canada is doing is what many mid-sized economies are starting to realize they need to do. They need to reduce exposure to unpredictable partners. They need to build redundancy into supply chains. They need to invest in domestic capacity even when globalization promised that such investments were inefficient. The era of assuming that open borders and frictionless trade would continue forever is over. The era of assuming that proximity to the United States was an automatic advantage is over. The new calculation is different. It asks, what happens if the border closes? What happens if the tariffs become permanent? What happens if the partner you relied on decides you are a competitor instead? The Winnipeg factory is an answer to those questions. A modest answer, a partial answer, but an answer that exists in physical form on Canadian soil. 250 jobs may not sound like much in an economy the size of Canada's, but those jobs represent something more important than their number. They represent the ability to finish what you start, to control the highest value stages of production, to not have to ask permission from a foreign government to complete a product in your own country. Now, the question is whether this becomes a trend or remains an isolated case. Because building domestic capacity is expensive, it requires government support. It requires companies to accept lower margins in the short term. It requires workers to be trained on new systems. And it only makes economic sense if you believe that the alternative, continued dependence on cross-border supply chains, carries risks that outweigh those costs. The Canadian government clearly believes that it does. The question is whether other sectors will follow the same logic. Because if this is the beginning of a broader industrial strategy, if Canada decides that buses are just the first of many products that should be built entirely at home, then what happened on March 3rd in Winnipeg was not just a manufacturing milestone. It was a signal. A signal that Canada is preparing for a world where trade is no longer governed by rules, but by leverage. Where proximity to the United States is a vulnerability as much as an advantage. Where the ability to manufacture independently is a form of national security. So the bigger question now is not just about buses. It is about strategy. When trade rules shift and markets become uncertain, should countries double down on globalization or invest more heavily in building at home? Winnipeg may not answer that question entirely, but it offers a glimpse of what that choice looks like in practice. One production line, one factory, and one finished bus at a time. The buses no longer cross the border to be finished. And that might be the most important change of all.